Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John, and today we're going to look at something that's been a challenge to e-pawn players for years. If you ever open a game with e4, then you've probably been tormented by the Caro Kann defense. This defense is incredibly hard to deal with. Getting an advantage with white from a theoretical standpoint is almost impossible, and it's even hard to get the kind of position you want to play. Recently, Kramnik said that if he were ever to return to professional chess, of course he was a world champion, the Caro Kann is probably what he would play against e4. And one of the ways people have often tried to deal with the Caro Kann is the exchange variation. There are a lot of repertoire books and videos on repertoires with e4 that have recommended the exchange variation, and it's an okay opening. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's never been that great. And traditionally, the exchange variation starts like this: e4, c6, d4. This is the Caro Kann defense, the c6, d5 move. Pawn takes, pawn takes. And white can play c4 here. That's the Panov Botvinnik attack. That's really a different opening. But traditionally, white would always play bishop to d3. And the idea is that white is playing against this bishop at c8, the black bishop, taking away all of its potential development squares. The bishop at d3 controls f5. The queen controls g4. White wants that bishop to be stuck behind the pawn chain and not be able to develop itself effectively. For many years, if I walked by a board and saw someone play this exchange variation, then with the white pieces play the move knight to f3, I thought, well, maybe they hadn't studied this opening very much. Everybody knows you don't play knight f3 here. You're supposed to play bishop to d3. Well, things have changed a bit. This knight f3 move has become kind of a popular move at very high levels. Some really strong players have played this. Even Magnus Carlsen has played knight to f3 in this position, I think 4 times. Kramnik has played it. A lot of Wesley So, I believe. A lot of really strong players have been playing this move. And what white is trying to do, they want to play that knight to e5 as quickly as possible, then develop this bishop to b5, and then try to get this bishop to d7, and then take the bishop with the knight. That's the idea. And the game we're going to look at today is a game between Ilya Smirin and Super Grandmaster Peter Svidler. Svidler has the black pieces. And after this game, Peter Svidler also started playing this knight to f3 move from time to time. Peter Svidler's opponent, Ilya Smirin, plays knight f3 in this game. Peter has black. He plays knight to f6. White plays knight e5. Black plays knight c6. Bishop b5. This is the idea. What white hopes for is black will play bishop d7, then takes, and c3. And basically you get the normal exchange variation of the Caro Kann with that light squared bishop already off the board. Now, this is still equal. It's not like white has some big advantage here, but it's a little different. It's a little wrinkle. And something a lot of players with the black pieces have a hard time adjusting to. So it's definitely a way to approach the game that can be very helpful. Bishop b5. Peter Svidler plays queen to a5 check, which is a double attack on the king and the bishop. But Ilya Smirin can save the bishop with knight to c3. That blocks the check and also defends the bishop on b5. Svidler plays bishop to d7, and white takes it. This is sort of the key idea. Knight takes, bishop to d2. So the bishop is creating X-ray pressure against the queen on a5. Peter Svidler plays rook to c8 to control that c7 square. If black instead were to get greedy and take the pawn on d4, white would play knight takes d5, which unleashes that bishop at d2 on the queen. And if that queen takes the bishop at b5, the knight to c7 check would win the queen. If instead the queen were to go back to d8, which you would really have to do, then this diabolical idea, Gawain Jones covers this game in a recent book, and he shows this variation. Bishop to a5, which hits the queen and attacks the knight on d4. So the queen would have to take the bishop with check, then b4, And that bishop at b5 is still off limits because of the knight c7 fork. The queen would have to go back to d8, then queen to d4. And white is just completely winning here. White castles, centralizes the rooks on the d and e files, and black has no chance. The game is just over. Computers will tell you that it's finished here. So Svidler plays rook to c8 to control that square. a4. White defends the bishop at b5 with the pawn, and now renews the threat of knight takes d5. Svidler plays queen to b6. If instead he defends d5 with e6, the knight takes d5, hitting the queen with the bishop, and after queen to d8, bishop takes knight, so black can't recapture on d4, and white would just be up a pawn in that case. Svidler plays queen to b6, a5, pushing the queen away, queen d4. If instead he plays knight takes a5, then bishop takes d7 check, king takes and knight takes pawn. That would be terrible for black. So he takes on d4, a6. Now this pawn has to be captured. If black tries to avoid the capture because he'd say he doesn't want to activate the rook at a1 with b6, the problem is that pawn at a7 is far too vulnerable, and the pawn at a6 could become a real problem later in the game. For example, bishop takes knight, rook takes knight, castles, and the threat is knight to b5, which would attack the queen at d4 and the pawn at a7, and he'd win that pawn. That would be curtains. If black were to try to, say, defend the b5 square to keep the knight out, so queen c4, then rook a4, queen c5, bishop e3, queen to d6, and now knight to b5. And he's just piling on in this position and giving black a very difficult time. So a6, pawn takes, bishop takes a6. Now, Gawain Jones in this position recommends the move rook to a6, and this is a really strong move. If black were to play, because the knight at c6 is being attacked twice, knight c to b8, then rook a4, attacking the queen, queen to e5 check, queen e2, queen takes, king takes, and after e6 to defend the d5 pawn, rook to a7, and white is doing quite well. If instead he plays knight d to b8, then this incredible move, queen to a1, and if the knight recaptures the rook, or captures the rook, queen a6, and there's a double attack on the rook and the knight, and white is doing quite well. But he takes with the bishop, rook to b8, castles, e6, the bishop goes back to b5 to attack the knight at c6, rook to c8, bishop to a6. Now the rook goes back to b8, sort of an offer to repeat moves, but the stronger move would have been rook to d8, after bishop b5, knight d to b5, black sort of holding the position together. But after rook to b8, bishop b5, rook to c8, now white goes ahead and plays rook to a6, attacking that knight at c6. Black has fought hard, and he's been able to create an equal position, but it's very easy to go wrong in these positions. This exchange variation with knight f3, for whatever reason, seems to really put pressure on black, and it's easy to make mistakes with the black pieces. I've played it quite a bit in Blitz, and have probably done better with it than any other line against the Caro Kann. And here, the great Peter Svidler makes a blunder. The best move here would be knight d to b8, to rook a4, queen b6, queen g4, hitting the g7 pawn, trying to keep that bishop at f8 from developing, threatening to play rook e1. But after a6, bishop takes, queen takes, rook e1, knight d7, black is unraveled and has a fine position. But Peter plays knight c to e5. Maybe I shouldn't call him Peter. You know, he's a super grandmaster. I should speak about him with more respect. Peter the Great, let's say. Knight c to e5, but queen to e2, and this is a real problem for black because those knights are awkwardly coordinated. They defend each other, but one knight is pinned, and the other knight is only defended by the queen. That makes them very sensitive, and all it would take is just a little push, perhaps, to get that black position to crack. Bishop to e7, rook to a4, an attempt to push the queen away So white can take the knight at e5. And remember, the knight at d7 could not recapture because of the pin. The knight goes to c4, moving away from attack and also blocking the rook's threat. Bishop to e3, queen to e5, rook takes a7. So white gets that pawn and is now attacking the knight on d7 with the rook and the bishop. Black plays rook to c7. If instead black had played rook to d8, then bishop takes knight, pawn takes rook to d1, and there's an attack on that d7 knight. If the knight goes to f6, then this incredible move, queen to f3, and the threat is to check on c6, and this creates all kinds of problems. Black can't castle because the bishop at e7 would hang. That's why that couldn't happen here. So if black played just, say, a passive move like h6, the threat would carry out like this. Queen c6 check, king f8, rook takes d8, bishop takes d8. Now first, queen to b7 with a threat of mate on f7. And the only way to block this is with, or to defend this is with the queen, but that moves the queen away from any possible defense, and then you just win the pinned bishop. And then queen to c7 would win it. So instead, he plays rook to c7. Now here, white responds with f4. Maybe not the most accurate move. Perhaps a better move would be rook c7, queen c7. Now rook to a1 with the threat of the rook coming to a7, supported by the bishop at e3. Knight takes bishop, queen takes bishop, bishop c5, then rook to a8, check. And now black has to deal with back rank pressure. And after king to e7, knight to d5, check. Forks the king and the queen. The e6 pawn is pinned by the queen. It also leaves the rook at h8 hanging. So when the dust settles here, white would have a decisive material advantage. Instead, white plays f4, wanting to push the queen away, keep pressure on the e-file. The queen goes to d6, but what instead if the queen had just taken on e3 with check? And that makes sense. Queen takes, knight takes, but then the rook at c7 is undefended. But black can recapture at f1. But then rook takes d7, knight to d2, rook to b7, discovered check. Probably the most powerful move in a game of chess is the discovered check. Or the double check, really, is the most powerful. Rook to b8 check, and the king would have to move, and then the rook at h8 would hang. So after f4, instead of capturing on e3, black plays the queen to d6 to keep that rook on c7 defended. The rook goes to a6, attacking the queen, but another very nice move that was discovered in this position was knight to e4. The knight would need to be captured because the queen really has nowhere to go, otherwise it drops the rook at c7. But after taking it, rook to d1, and the queen is pushed away, and the rook at c7 would fall. It cannot be defended. But Ilya Smirin plays rook to a6. Queen takes, bishop takes. Knight takes e3, knight to b5. In the game, rook to c6 was played. Perhaps the best move here is rook to c4. By the way, the material imbalance is white has a queen, but black has a knight and a rook. So it's basically a one-pawn value difference. But one problem is king safety, the fact that black isn't castled yet, and also white has these two pawns that could become really powerful in an endgame. But rook c4, rook f2, the rook was threatened. Then castles, queen takes knight, bishop c5, regains some material. The queen goes to c2, bishop f2 check, king f2. Then black could play knight to c5, and the bishop at a6 is in big trouble. If white played queen to a1 to try to defend it, then rook a8 would pin it and win it. And black would actually be a little bit better in that case. If white tried to defend it with a knight going to c7, then this little nasty move from black, knight to d3 check, forking the king and queen, and the pawn at c2 is pinned. So if it takes the knight, the rook would take the queen. So rook to c4 was definitely a better attempt to keep the game going. But black plays rook to c6, knight to d4, attacks the rook to b6, rook to a1. Now that knight on e3 is hanging. Where can it go? If it goes to f5, knight takes f5, ef5, bishop to c8, knight f6, then rook to a7, and everything's meeting at the e7 square. If it goes to c4, then bishop takes, rook to a8 check, rook b8 takes, and then f5, castles fe6, and white is putting a lot of pressure on black's position. In the game, knight to c2 was played. White recaptures, castles, bishop to b5, attacking the knight on d7, knight f6, rook to a6, rook b7, b4. White has the passed pawn and wants to advance it to the queening square. Knight e4, bishop c6, attacking the rook at b7 and also clearing the way for the b pawn to advance to the queening square. And in this position, Peter Svidler, Grandmaster, Super Grandmaster, resigned. So this is something you can put in your repertoire, try it out in Blitz. Instead of playing bishop to d3 in the Caro Kann exchange variation, give knight f3 a try. It's a good chance you'll surprise your opponents and get some wins that you might not have gotten otherwise. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.